At 11:20 at night on July 11th, 2026, a storm that had once carried winds of 285 kilometers an hour crossed the coastline near the town of Yuhuan in China's Zhejiang province, with winds measured at just 144 kilometers an hour. That number alone tells you almost nothing until you understand what this storm used to be. 6 days earlier, that same system had been a Category 5 super typhoon, one of the most violent storms on the planet in all of 2026, tearing across a tiny island called Rota with gusts that emergency officials described as catastrophic and life-threatening. By the time it reached the Chinese coast for its final landfall, it had been reduced to roughly half its peak strength, a storm still dangerous, still capable of killing people and flooding cities, but a shadow of the monster it had been at its height. This is the story of Typhoon Bobby, and specifically the story of its final hours, the slow, dramatic, and often overlooked collapse of a storm that had briefly ranked among the strongest cyclones on Earth. To understand why those final hours were so remarkable, you have to go back to the beginning, because Bobby's death was every bit as extreme as its birth. The storm formed over the warm waters of the western Pacific east of Guam in early July 2026, and almost immediately it did something that meteorologists both fear and marvel at. It underwent what is called rapid intensification, a process where a storm's winds increase dramatically in a very short window of time. The official threshold for rapid intensification is a wind speed increase of at least 35 miles per hour in 24 hours. Bobby blew past that number so completely that it barely counts as a comparison. In the 24 hours ending at noon, Universal Time on July the 3rd, the storm's winds increased by 75 miles an hour. Extend that window to 36 hours, and the increase reaches 100 miles an hour. Think about that for a moment. In a day and a half, a disorganized tropical disturbance transformed into one of the most powerful storms the world would see all year, gaining more strength in 36 hours than most hurricanes gain in their entire lifespan. By the afternoon of July the 3rd, Bavi had already become the third Category 5 equivalent tropical cyclone of 2026 globally, with winds estimated near 160 miles an hour. But it did not stop there. The atmosphere and the ocean beneath the storm were unusually favorable, and forecasters watched with a mixture of awe and dread as the storm continued to strengthen toward what is sometimes called its maximum potential intensity, the theoretical ceiling of how strong a storm can get, given the temperature of the water and the structure of the atmosphere above it. Some forecast models suggested Bavi could approach 200 miles an hour with a central pressure as low as 880 millibars, numbers that would place it among the most intense tropical cyclones ever recorded anywhere on the planet. The storm did not quite reach that theoretical ceiling, but what it did reach was still almost unbelievable. On July 5th and into the early morning hours of July 6th local time, Bavi's eye moved directly over the small island of Rota, the southernmost inhabited island in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, a United States territory home to roughly 2,000 people. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center assessed the storm's 1-minute sustained winds at landfall at 285 kilometers an hour, or about 180 miles an hour, with a central pressure of 901 millibars. Numbers like a 901 millibar pressure reading are the kind of statistic meteorologists use to describe truly historic storms, because the lower the pressure at a storm center, the more intense the wind field surrounding it tends to be. This made Bobby one of the strongest typhoons on record to ever strike the Northern Mariana Islands. The National Weather Service office responsible for the region issued warnings in the starkest possible language, telling residents of Rota to treat the approaching winds the way they would treat an incoming tornado, and to move immediately into an interior room. As the western eyewall, the ring of most intense wind and rain that surrounds a hurricane's calm center, moved over the island at roughly 7 in the morning local time, the agency described the unfolding situation as a catastrophic and life-threatening event. Sustained winds exceeding 150 miles an hour battered the island for an extended period, and satellite imagery captured from the Himawari 9 weather satellite suggested that Rota was entirely engulfed within the eye of the storm, an extraordinarily rare alignment for an island of its modest size. What makes this moment even more striking is the context surrounding it. The Northern Mariana Islands had already been battered earlier that same year by another Category 5 storm, Super Typhoon Sinlaku, which struck in April with winds near 185 miles an hour and left widespread destruction in its wake. A local National Weather Service meteorologist described the string of severe typhoons hitting the territory in 2026 as bringing the region to what he called a crippled state. At the time Bavi arrived, more than 1,000 families in the islands were still living in tents because their homes had not yet been repaired from the earlier storm. Some communities in the northern islands had gone months without electricity. Into that already fragile situation came a second Category 5 storm in the span of a single typhoon season, and this time it struck a different island directly. The fact that the Northern Mariana Islands endured 2 separate Category 5 landfalls within the same year, Sinlaku in April and Bavi in July, is itself a statistically unusual and sobering detail. Sinlaku had struck with winds near 185 miles an hour, its large eye passing directly over both Tinian and Saipan simultaneously, an alignment that meant two populated islands absorbed the storm's most violent core at the same time, rather than one island bearing the brunt while its neighbors were spared. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center had assessed Sinlaku as a Category 4 equivalent storm with sustained winds of 145 miles an hour at the moment of landfall, still a devastating figure, and one that left at least 17 people dead across the region, along with extensive structural damage. For a territory with a relatively small and geographically concentrated population, absorbing two storms of this caliber within a matter of months represents an extraordinary test of resilience, one that stretched emergency shelters, construction crews, and basic utility infrastructure to their limits well before Bavi's eye ever reached Rota. This broader context matters because it reshapes how we should think about a single storm's final hours. A typhoon does not simply end when its winds fade below some official threshold. Its consequences ripple outward for months afterward, through displaced families still living in temporary shelters, through overwhelmed relief agencies, through power grids and water systems that take far longer to rebuild than the storm took to destroy them. Bavi's own final hours, its slow decay over the coast and interior of China, would eventually follow a similar pattern in miniature, a storm whose winds faded quickly, but whose consequences, in the form of floodwater and disrupted infrastructure, lingered for days and weeks after the system itself had ceased to exist on any official forecast map. It helps to understand exactly what an eyewall replacement cycle is doing to a storm during moments like this, because it explains so much of the up and down, almost roller coaster pattern that defined Bavi's entire life. At its final landfall in China, those winds had fallen to roughly half that figure. In under a week, a storm that had ranked among the most powerful cyclones on the planet had lost more than half of its peak wind speed, even while remaining strong enough to force the evacuation of nearly 2 million people and inflict serious damage across an entire province. By the afternoon of July 12th, less than a day after making landfall, Bobby had already pushed into eastern Anhui province, continuing its northwestward trek across China's interior. Yet even as the storm's winds continued to fade, its rainfall remained a serious and in some ways underappreciated hazard. What makes this transformation genuinely remarkable is not simply that it happened, because nearly all tropical cyclones weaken eventually. What makes it remarkable is the scale and speed of the collapse, especially when set against the scale and speed of the storm's earlier explosive growth. This was a system that intensified by 100 miles an hour in a day and a half on its way up, and that ultimately gave back well over half of its peak wind speed within about a week on its way down, all while continuing to influence weather and threaten lives across 5 or 6 different countries and territories along the way. Few storms in any given year manage to touch such a wide stretch of the globe, from United States territory in the far western Pacific to the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and finally deep into mainland China, over such an extended and eventful lifespan. There is also something worth reflecting on in how differently the storm's final hours were experienced compared to its violent beginning. When Bavi struck Rota at Category 5 strength, the story was one of sudden, overwhelming violence, a storm arriving with winds so extreme that officials could only compare the danger to a tornado, and urge residents to seek shelter in the most interior room of their homes. When Bobby made its final landfall in Zhejiang, the story had shifted to one of scale and endurance. Nearly 2 million people evacuated, not because the winds themselves were catastrophic in the way they had been at Rota, but because the storm still carried enough organized energy and enough moisture to threaten a densely populated coastline, and because the flooding that would follow in the days after landfall would ultimately prove just as consequential as the wind had been at the storm's peak. In many ways, this is the lesson embedded in the final hours of any major typhoon, and Bobby's death illustrates it with unusual clarity. A storm's classification, whether it is labeled a super typhoon, a Category 1 equivalent system, or simply a remnant low, tells only part of the story of the danger it poses. The Category 5 winds that battered Rota were the most visually dramatic and statistically extreme moment of Bobby's life. But the flooding that followed its much weaker final landfall in China, hundreds of miles inland and days after the winds had faded, proved lethal in its own right and disrupted the lives of millions of people who never experienced anything close to the storm's peak intensity. The record-breaking rainfall in Shenyang came from a system that, on paper, no longer even qualified as a typhoon. Bavi's full track, from its explosive formation east of Guam through its historic Category 5 landfall on Rota, its long westward march past the Philippines, Taiwan, and Japan's southern islands, and finally its weakening arrival and slow death across eastern China, offers a rare, complete portrait of a tropical cyclone's entire life cycle, from the most violent beginning imaginable to a quiet, almost anticlimactic dissolution over the Yellow Sea. It began as one of the strongest storms on the planet, and it ended as a barely detectable area of low pressure, its winds reduced from 285 kilometers an hour to a mere 45 kilometers an hour, roughly the strength of a stiff, gusty day rather than a historic typhoon. It is worth considering, too, just how differently this storm would be remembered if you only looked at snapshots from its beginning and its end without tracing everything that happened in between. Someone who only saw the satellite images from Rota, the tightly wound eye, the symmetrical spiral of thunderstorms, the 901 millibar pressure reading, would remember Bavi as one of the defining storms of the year, a system that belongs in the conversation with the most intense tropical cyclones ever observed in the Western Pacific. Someone who only saw the news coverage of its final landfall in Zhejiang, a Category 1 equivalent storm coming ashore late at night, weakening steadily as it pushed inland, might be forgiven for assuming this was a comparatively minor, almost routine weather event, the kind of storm that generates a few days of regional headlines and then fades from memory. Both of those impressions would be incomplete on their own, and it is only by tracing the entire arc, from the explosive rapid intensification east of Guam to the record-breaking rainfall recorded in Shenyang more than a week later, that the true scope of the storm becomes clear. This is also why meteorologists and emergency planners tend to resist the temptation to treat wind category alone as a reliable proxy for overall danger, especially during a storm's final hours. Bavi's own trajectory demonstrates precisely why that instinct can be so misleading. If evacuation planning in Zhejiang had been based solely on the fact that the storm had weakened to Category 1, equivalent strength by the time of landfall, authorities might have been tempted to scale back their response relative to what a Category 5 storm would warrant. Instead, officials evacuated nearly 2 million people, a scale of precaution that reflected an understanding that a weakening wind field does not necessarily mean a weakening overall threat, particularly when a storm still carries an enormous reservoir of tropical moisture and is approaching a coastline already saturated by earlier rain. That decision, in hindsight, appears to have been the correct one, given the record rainfall that followed in Shenyang and the continued flood risk that persisted across multiple provinces for days after the winds themselves had become a secondary concern. And yet, even in those final weakened hours, the storm was not without consequence. It forced the evacuation of millions. It grounded hundreds of flights. It halted rail service across an entire province, and it dumped record-breaking rainfall on a city hundreds of miles from where its winds first came ashore. The final hours of Typhoon Bavi were unbelievable, not because the storm was still at its most powerful, but precisely because it was not. They were unbelievable because a system that had lost more than half its peak intensity could still command an evacuation on the scale of a small country's population, still break decades-old rainfall records, and still remind everyone watching just how much destructive potential can remain hidden inside a storm long after the headlines have stopped calling it a super typhoon. By the time meteorologists finally closed the book on Bobby, marking its full dissipation over the Yellow Sea on July 16th, the storm had been a continuous presence in the weather patterns of the Western Pacific and East Asia for roughly 2 weeks. It had been discussed, tracked, warned about, and endured across half a dozen countries and territories, leaving behind a trail of evacuation orders, damaged homes, flooded streets, and tragically, lives lost, from the landslides in the southern Philippines to the flooding across eastern China. Few single storms manage to touch so much of the map in one uninterrupted lifespan, and few offer such a stark, almost textbook illustration of just how far a tropical cyclone can fall from its peak, while still remaining dangerous enough to change the course of daily life for millions of people. That, in the end, is the real story hidden inside a single wind speed reading taken on the night of July 11th, 2026, as a storm that had once ranked among the most powerful on the planet slipped quietly onto the coast of Zhejiang province at a fraction of its former strength, closing out one of the more extraordinary tropical cyclone life cycles of the entire year.